G'day everyone, and welcome to a 2022 update for our video 4.2.12 for the Legal Studies Guide, looking at our recent Royal Commission. Very quickly, our quote for today: if opportunity doesn't knock, build a door, or even just consider knocking down the wall. This is just that idea of, particularly with your exams coming up, don't wait around for someone to open the door for you. Don't wait around for motivation. Don't wait around for someone to say, hey, you should do some study. It's like, if you want it, go and get it. Be proactive, step up. Don't just sit around waiting for something to happen, because that's when, you're going to get nothing done in life. So, go and get what you deserve after sticking it through for this long, 12 years of schooling, for 13 years really, only a few weeks to go. As I said, fresh video for 4.2.12, a recent example of, specifically, and we're going to talk about this, specifically one recommendation from a Royal Commission. So we're going to do Royal Commission, not Parliamentary Committee. And obviously this all feeds into, as we went over in the 4.2.11 video, the idea of looking at this example all feeds into our ability to evaluate. So the positives and negatives of Royal Commissions. How good are they at influencing a change in the law, which is what they more or less exist to do through their recommendations process. So ultimately, what's an example of a recent Royal Commission? You should be able to answer at the end, and how's that going to help us understand the strengths and weaknesses of Royal Commissions in terms of influencing law reform. So, the previous video I did for this looked at the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. There's some recommendations for that are ongoing, and governments are responding, have said they're going to respond basically every year to update how they're going with it. So look, there's technically an ability to still use that because it is an ongoing process. But this video is going to look at a Royal Commission that actually finished this year, start of this year, and that was the Royal Commission into aged care quality and safety, that's just colloquially known as the Aged Care Royal Commission. And look, this is the letters patent, as we know. That's how you commence a Royal Commission. The Governor-General issues this idea of, hey, we want a commission to be formed to look at this issue. The Governor-General does that on the advice of the government. So really, it's the government of the day and the Prime Minister's job to call a Royal Commission and decide the terms of reference for it, and then the Governor-General just does the formality of asking for it, or establishing it. And look, thinking about how this connects to the other areas of 4.2 is really important. So the big one is often the need for law reform. So generally speaking, Royal Commissions are called when there is an issue of great public concern. Usually there's been some kind of wrongdoing, something's not working the way it's meant to be done, and we need a Royal Commission to get to the bottom of it. And this is what was happening in aged care. And thinking back for those reasons for law reform, sometimes we need to change the law just because it's not working properly, because it's harming people the way it currently is. And that's effectively what was happening here. There were lots of stories coming out, so we're looking at role of the media, another thing we've looked at. Lots of stories coming out in the media about really, really poor outcomes for elderly people in care, particularly, horrible photos of people not being taken out of their beds for days and having, shocking pressure wounds. Some of the meals people were being served, hearing stories of, people soiling themselves and not being found until relatives came to visit. Just really shocking outcomes. Media sort of highlights this, lots of, outrage, what's being done, and the government goes, well, we're going to call a Royal Commission to try and figure it out. And there's a lot of pressure on them to do that. And look, effectively, this is what the Royal Commission was established to look at. We can quite simply see, it's pretty broad. Let's look at the quality of aged care services provided to Australians. Just broadly, how good is aged care? Then look at how do we best deliver aged care. So what are we going to do to get a better model? So on and so forth. In this case, terms of reference is really broad. It can be quite narrow, which can be a weakness of Royal Commissions, but this one, Aged Care Royal Commission, broad terms of reference. What's happening in aged care now? How can we improve it? Effectively, as we know, Royal Commissions start with letters patent, as I just said, in the terms of reference. These were amended twice because the commissioners, the royal commissioners, the people who run the royal commission process, they changed a few times. There were 2 appointed, one of those 2 stepped down, and then unfortunately another, the replacement, I think it was, I can't remember off the top of my head, either got very unwell or passed away, and they had to appoint another royal commissioner. So they had to adjust the letters patent a few times. Once a royal commission is established through the referral process, they will usually then do a bunch of background research. They'll call for submissions on some of the background research they do. They'll release what are called consultation papers that will be like, hey, like, we've been investigating different models of care. Can we get some submissions related to that? And they'll give people a chance to basically respond to the research they've done, respond to the issues they've looked at. So a real sort of fact-finding background to the issue is the initial process that a Royal Commission will undertake. Submissions can be made by anyone, and we'll show you some examples afterwards. Submissions from individuals, submissions from groups, so be they aged care providers, be they industry groups, be they unions, and organisations like specific aged care providers will put in submissions. Hospitals associations will put in submissions, and these will all get published online, and they're used by the commissioners, and the commissioners might look at it and go, or the people assisting them might go, hey, we want to call that person back later on and hear from them in person. And that's where you have public hearings, and that research continues. There ended up being 20 research papers released covering key areas in the aged care system, things like, there's a research paper on how aged care providers responded to COVID. There's a research paper on, I think, the use of like chemical restraints, so, drugging people so that they are docile, particularly if they've got dementia, which is a really problematic thing that was happening far too regularly. I think I did a research paper on food in aged care. And then they hold public hearings. They held 23 of them, mostly in capital cities, but a few regional ones as well. And that's where they bring people in to give evidence, and people are questioned. So it is set up like a little bit of a courtroom, these hearings. They're all available to view on YouTube. The Royal Commission itself has a YouTube channel. And this is where providers, people who work in aged care, people who've received aged care will answer questions put to them, and obviously they have to answer those truthfully about what goes on. And these public hearings would focus on things like accommodation, but also like focused on in-home care, because aged care can have the people who aren't actually in a facility but they stay living at home, and they get support at home, how it's funded, where the money for this comes from, so on and so forth. Once all of that's happened, so it's a whole heap of fact-finding, that's when we start getting to, okay, what are we going to do moving forward? And the people supporting the Royal Commissioners, who are lawyers, so counsels assisting, will start writing up recommendations, putting those out for consultation as well. People can submit their views on those. And eventually the 2 Royal Commissioners were able to produce a final report. And the final report covered 5 volumes. It was thousands of pages long across those 5 volumes. And ultimately it had 148 recommendations. They said, here's 148 things we think you should do that will improve the quality of aged care in Australia. They also released an interim report calling for some immediate actions, particularly around reducing the ability of providers to use chemical restraints. And they released a special report about COVID-19. But ultimately, after you do all the fact-finding and you get all the details, you talk to people involved, you get submissions from people, you do your research, you come up with a final report that has a list of recommendations. And then we get to the government's response. Now, this was a really tricky one because this was released, the final report was released either start of this year, end of last year, but effectively in the end of the Morrison government. And they sort of said that they were going to respond in a certain way. The Labor government, who have since been elected, want to respond differently. And they've actually already passed the first pieces of legislation the new Labor government put through Parliament when it reconvened after the election were aged care legislation that were implementing about 14 of the recommendations of the 148 that they could. This was a really tricky Royal Commission, though, and we'll talk about this in its weaknesses, in that the two Royal Commissioners actually fundamentally disagreed on a couple of things, and as a result of the 148 recommendations, some of them were contradictory, which means you can only take one of the two. So there's no ability for a government to say we're going to implement every recommendation, because some of the recommendations were actually the opposites of each other. So the two Royal Commissioners couldn't agree on funding, how to do funding properly, and they couldn't agree on oversight. So one Royal Commissioner wanted to establish an entirely new independent body that would oversee aged care in Australia, and the other one wanted to adjust the current system so that the ministers of health, more or less in each state, and the Federal Minister for Health would have aged care added and would be directly responsible for aged care. So a little bit of separation of powers stuff there, in that one commissioner really wanted it to stay with the ministers, who are elected figures, and therefore that responsibility of them as ministers and part of the executive, they're also held accountable through Parliament and then by the electorate through the legislature. Whereas the other one wanted to establish a completely separate executive body using legislation that would then operate a little bit independently to hold aged care providers to account. Lots in the weeds there that you don't need to know too much about, but just thinking about again, this is quite unique, but some of the weaknesses, hey, the Royal Commissioners in this case didn't agree, so how are we supposed to get a good response from the government if the two people who did all of this work couldn't come to a uniform agreed position? Some quick fast facts. They received 10,500 submissions. There were 6,800 telephone calls to their information line, and at the 23 hearings, they spoke to 641 witnesses. And think about the amount of information they were able to gather on aged care to then come up with recommendations to improve the system. Royal Commission's really, really extensive, which is one of their strengths. So, looking at submissions. This one is, so I'm going to show you more or less 3 submissions, just so you get an idea of the scope of submissions that again speak to the strength of a Royal Commission. This submission was made right at the start of the Royal Commission in the early fact-finding stage. It was just an online submission, and you'll see here that spelling errors and everything included. What would you like to tell the Royal Commission? As a community care worker, so this is a submission just from an individual who works in aged care. So this is, again, the scope of a Royal Commission. You're hearing from someone who works in aged care. And they're saying they wanted to remain anonymous because they work in aged care. They said, as a community care worker, I'm concerned that providers are profit-driven and encourage customers to access as many services as they can, whether they need the service or not. So basically, this person's saying, I work in aged care and I'm worried that the people who provide aged care are just trying to make money. They don't care about the patient themselves, which was a common issue that was coming up. So you're getting sort of submissions from individuals. Then you get submissions from a group like this. This is an 18-page submission in response to one of the consultation papers. The consultation papers had questions like, in what ways could aged care be made easier to access? And this response is from the Australian Hospitals Association. So this is an industry body that represents all the hospitals in Australia. And they're like, hey, we think you could make aged care better by having a person-centred pathway, promote the consumer's right to have greater control over their choices. So things like that. So again, you're getting submissions from individuals, you're getting submissions from groups, organisations, and this was also a submission from the Australian government. So you're actually getting a submission from the government to the Royal Commission. So this shows the independence of a Royal Commission. The government's not running it, the government establishes it, and then it's run independently. And the government puts in submissions. So this was their submission to more or less the final list of recommendations before they went out. And it's just a really interesting one. This is a submission from the Department of Health and the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission with input from other Commonwealth agencies. So this is an input from submission from basically the public servants, the people who work behind the scenes to regulate and run the health system and aged care, not politicians. And you'll note here that they say very early on, this one was, 20-something pages. The Commonwealth notes that its response to the recommendations represent the views of relevant departments and agencies. They do not necessarily represent the views of the relevant ministers or the Australian government. So they're basically being like, hey, this is our view as professionals who regulate the area, but the politicians might have a different view, because we know politicians are primarily focused on what's popular, because they're focused on re-election and those other political pressures that come to play. And indeed, in another submission from the government, one of the recommendations was that they should throw out the old Aged Care Act and implement a new one. And you'll see here the Commonwealth considers that the precise wording of a new act is a matter which would need to be considered in detail in the context of drafting legislation with appropriate consultation. AKA, yes, you can recommend what you want to do to the law, the Royal Commission, but you don't actually change the law. And we know that this is a strong weakness of a Royal Commission, is that ultimately the government is not obligated to respond. The government does not have to pass legislation to enact these recommendations. And very clearly here they're saying, hey, we recommend you implement a new Aged Care Act, and you define aged care as support and care for people. You try and make it not profit-driven, you try and make it person-driven. And the government very clearly saying, thank you for your recommendation, but what the law says is up to us as politicians. We will still ultimately decide. So, thank you. So that's an important thing to note. That's what the final report looked like. And here is the speech made in Parliament by the Minister for Aged Care and the Minister for Sport in July this year. And this was Anika Wells, and she's talking about, hey, we are introducing our first bit of legislation as a new government. We're implementing legislation that basically looks to enact some of the recommendations from the Royal Commission. Now, look, I'll let you pause and read that if you want. It's quite, it's helpful to read in terms of understanding politics a little bit, because in it she trashes the previous government a bit. She's basically being like, hey, aged care's been in crisis, aged care's no good, we've had all these recommendations from the Royal Commission and other inquiries, and we know that nothing's changed in the last decade. Strangely enough, that's how long the previous government was in power for. So she's using this speech to score political points as well. And she goes on to say, hey, this is what's in the bill, and this is what I want us to focus on, because I'll show you in a moment from a past VCAR exam. When they say a recent example of a Royal Commission, they want you to know a specific law reform recommendation from that Royal Commission. So they don't want you to know too much, and I've given you a lot of info about this Royal Commission. They want you to know one specific recommendation that Royal Commission made. And we are going to focus on a pretty simple one, and who knows how helpful this actually is, but we are going to focus on this. The idea that we should have star ratings, kind of like for a hotel or a restaurant, for our aged care providers. So that was one of the recommendations from the Royal Commission. The implementation of star ratings, so that as a consumer, if you're putting your mother or your father or your grandparents into aged care, or you are choosing an aged care provider yourself, you first of all basically get to see how many stars they have, to see if they're good at what they do. And this was recommendation 24. By 1st of July 2022, the Australian government should develop and publish a system of star ratings based on measurable indicators to basically compare aged care providers. So that was the recommendation, star ratings for aged care providers. And this is the explanatory memoranda for that bill that we just looked at. In line with recommendation 24 of the Royal Commission, the star ratings will be published on a website called My Aged Care, and these are the things that the star ratings will cover. So basically, legislation was passed in 2022, literally last month now, to implement this recommendation. So we can see that the Royal Commission was successful in at least getting this recommendation implemented. So, skills. Evaluate the ability of law reform bodies to influence a change in the law using recent examples. Our key word here, evaluate, knowing that evaluate means to give a value judgment on how good something is. So evaluation is how good is something, and we know to do a true evaluation, to consider how good something is, we have to show that we've considered both its positives and its negatives. Okay? So what are the strengths of a Royal Commission and what are the weaknesses? And if we see this question from the exam 2 years ago that was done quite poorly, the use of parliamentary committees and Royal Commissions serve a number of valuable purposes. Referring to one recent example of a recommendation for law reform, explain one strength and one weakness of, we'll get rid of the either, a Royal Commission in influencing a change in the law. So really clearly, using a recent example, explain one strength of a Royal Commission and one weakness of a Royal Commission. And we'll see here, done quite poorly, like quite easy to get to the 3 and the 4, but hard to get to 5 and 6 like usual. A lot of people getting 0. This point here is the point I want to make. Students were also required to use a recent example of a recommendation for law reform. This required students to refer to a specific recent recommendation that was made by a Royal Commission, e.g., the recommendation for a levy to be imposed in regards to the Royal Commission into mental health. A reference to a recent committee or commission was not enough. So this is the key thing. You don't just need to know about a recent Royal Commission. You need to know a specific recommendation that Royal Commission made. And our one here is that this Royal Commission called for star ratings for aged care providers, and a law was subsequently passed to introduce star ratings for aged care providers and the publication of those. Okay? Read that as well. Pause and have a read of that if you want. So, after we've been through all of this, what are the strengths and weaknesses of a Royal Commission? How do we know if they're good at what they do? Well, really clearly, it has a wide range of investigative powers we've gone over. They can compel witnesses to attend. They do background research. They have consultation papers. They get over 10,000 submissions. Ultimately, you are going to get a final report with recommendations that cover the entirety of the issue and are ultimately good recommendations. And if they're good recommendations, they're more likely to lead to law reform. They often expose wrongdoing. This one particularly exposed a lot of wrongdoing from aged care providers, which again can lead to strengthened criminal laws, can lead to more action effectively to improve how our legal system operates. They're publicly respected. Royal Commissions are independent, as we showed by the fact that the Australian government was adding submissions. They weren't running the process. And the public, as a result, tends to get the recommendations given by a Royal Commission and goes, yeah, we'll just implement them then. It provides a lot of weight to this law reform that governments ultimately feel a lot more pressure to then implement. And that's because they also attract a large amount of publicity. So the publicity that comes with these recommendations that are well respected means you are more likely to get legislative change. Not effective though. What are their weaknesses? Well, as I showed you, no obligation. And we saw that star ratings were meant to come in for the 1st of July this year. Didn't get that legislation passed until August because the previous government their bill made it to the Senate, but they were slower to act on it than the new incoming government was. Royal Commissions can often be seldom used. They can be really expensive and time-consuming. This one took 2 years and cost $92 million to run. So governments avoid using them. And governments avoid using them as well because they often result in negative sentiment towards the government of the day. So particularly this one was called for by the Morrison government and basically highlighted that, hey, for the last 10 years, aged care's gone to shit. That looks bad on the Morrison government. So they were really reluctant to call for this, and they withstood pressure for a long time to call a Royal Commission until finally it was like aged care was going so bad that they're like, we've got no option, we have to call a Royal Commission. It also means that since the new Labor government has come to power, they've used this Royal Commission to really score political points against the Liberals. They've even called for a new Royal Commission that'll start soon into robo-debt, which was a program under the previous government that was subsequently found to be illegal, using a computer system to figure out who owed money and then issuing debts that were wrong. And as much as a lot of people would argue that there needs to be an inquiry into that, you also can undoubtedly argue that the current Labor government is also pursuing that to score political points, to expose wrongdoing from the previous Liberal government to help them maintain their political standing. So Royal Commissions can be used as a bit of a political tool as well, which kind of can ruin or impact their effectiveness. And look, specifically in this instance, one of the weaknesses was that there was a lack of consensus. Ultimately, they did all this work and they couldn't agree. And if they can't agree, if people are in two camps on what to do, we know that if there's potentially conflict, there's legislation that could be a little bit controversial, or there's vocal groups who have different views on something, Parliament's likely to avoid legislating in that area because they don't want the conflict. They don't want to piss people off. They will basically try and only legislate change if there's broad public support for it. So quite unique in this instance, but there wasn't consensus on the best way forward, which was a weakness of this specific Royal Commission. So lots and lots there about why Royal Commissions are good, but also why they can be not so effective at what they do. I'll put these links in the description. A media article from The Guardian about that legislation that passed Parliament. Here's an article about the Royal Commissioners being split on their views. That's quite an interesting read about their differing views on the way forward for aged care. And then if you just want to go to the Royal Commission website, you can check it out there. Ultimately, hopefully by watching this, you have a better understanding of how Royal Commissions work, but particularly you understand this idea that you must know a specific recommendation for law reform from the Royal Commission, not just know a Royal Commission broadly. And that is a vitally important point to make sure that you are not wasting your time on an exam. As always, comments below, feedback welcome, and happy studying heading into the holidays.